Upon learning President Trump tested positive for coronavirus, Democratic Party figures like Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, even Hillary, they expressed statements expressing their support for the president. Russiagate ringleader Rachel Maddow even dedicated a full Get Well segment to Trump in which she encouraged viewers to have the same compassion for the president as you would for a friend with lung cancer.
And as The Intercept's Glenn Greenwald notes, maybe, just maybe, it's possible Democratic leaders don't really believe some of the things that they've said about President Trump over the past 4 years. For example, calling him a racist, a fascist tyrant, all for political advantage. Co-founding editor at The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, joins us now to explain how they sort of reconcile those two messages. Glenn, it's great to see you.
Good to see you, Glenn.
Good to be with you guys.
Absolutely. So just lay out the argument that you were making in the piece here.
So I've always had a distaste for the practice of liberals and Democrats anointing themselves the resistance from the very beginning of the Trump presidency, because typically the resistance is a term used for oppositional movements that are endangered by a tyrant or a despot. It's something, for example, that got applied to Jews who fought so valiantly in the Warsaw Ghetto against the Nazis, or against the French who were fighting Nazi occupation under the Vichy government. And so it seemed like a very inappropriate and self-glorifying term, because the implication is the U.S. is no longer a democracy where you can vote the president out of office, that it's now actually a dictatorship where to oppose him or to criticize him puts you in the kind of danger that resistance fighters typically have been in. And lately, that rhetoric has escalated rather significantly as the election approaches, where it's now commonplace in Democratic discourse to explicitly say that Trump is a fascist dictator, and even to invoke Hitler and Nazism to suggest that that's the proper prism through which we ought to understand the Trump presidency. And if that's the case, if Trump is some kind of a fascist dictator who is posing to end American democracy and freedoms, or has already done so, who puts dissidents in danger, then you would expect the reaction to news that he has a fatal disease and might die not to be one of sorrow and lament, but one of joy and celebration. That's typically how people react when dictators are ill, or when they're in danger, or when they die. And so there's this obvious tension, this conflict between, on the one hand, claiming Trump is like Hitler, or is imposing fascist white supremacy tyranny on the United States, and on the other hand saying, we wish you a speedy recovery, Mr. President. We hope that you get back really soon to the fascist tyranny and genocide that you're imposing on the United States. And I thought it was worth exploring what accounts for that tension.
Well, what does account for that tension, really, Glenn? I mean, what? And actually, here's the real thing. What type of political discourse do we want? I actually want the one where we, generally we're like, oh, the democratically elected leader, hope he gets better. Even if we disagree with him, get out there. Even if you want to see him, then he can be voted against. I mean, what does a good political discourse around something like this look like in a democracy? And how undermining has it been, the type of rhetoric that you're talking about there?
Well, in general, I agree with you. I think that not only our political system, but we as human beings are healthier if we are not wishing death upon other people, if it's not standard or commonplace for us to celebrate the suffering of other human beings. I think that when we start doing those things, it coarsens not only the society, but also ourselves. And so in general, I think it is a very important aspiration to say that no matter how much we disagree with someone politically, we're going to resolve those political differences not through violence or wishing death on the other on someone, because that can lead to very negative results, but through political processes, through democratic competition, through debate and words and discussion rather than death. But the assumption of the question is that we have a working democracy. If we actually have somebody who gets elected and then proceeds to dismantle the mechanisms of democracy and does start to impose tyranny, fascist dictatorship, then I'm not sure that it is true that it's healthy to say that then recovers and gets healthy. Maybe it is healthier to say, oh, we hope that person dies, or we're going to celebrate if they do. That's what people do in tyrannies when their dictator dies. Yeah. So I think that that's the point, right, Sagar, is that it gives the lie to this claim that we are living under a dictatorship, because if we were, not only would it not be obligatory, it would actually almost be immoral to say that we hope the person responsible for imposing fascism gets well quickly and recovers. And the reason I think it's important is not just because of this inconsistency aspect, but because I think it's important to understand what kind of country we really have and what the genuine dangers are as opposed to the ones that are claimed for political advantage.
Yeah.
Glenn, compare the way that President Trump has responded to his own COVID diagnosis with Bolsonaro in Brazil. What impact did that have on his popularity? How did people respond in Brazil to the revelation that he had COVID? Just talk through some of that, because that's been something that's been floated in the media recently as well.
Yeah, so, I've been on your show before, and we've talked about the differences between Trump and Bolsonaro that are very significant, but they do have similarities, one of which is they both believe it's extremely important to project an image of strength. That's a crucial part of their political appeal. No weakness, no vulnerability, always strength and fearlessness and invincibility. And so when Bolsonaro finally contracted the coronavirus after months of mocking it and downplaying it far more extremely than Trump even did, the fact that he seemed to recover pretty quickly and never really got sick, unlike Trump, he was never actually hospitalized with it, gave him this kind of opportunity to say, see, I told you so, because he's about 10 years younger than Trump. He's 65. But remember, 2 years ago, he was near fatally stabbed. His intestinal system was torn apart by a knife. He underwent multiple surgeries, making his entire system somewhat compromised. The fact that he came so relatively trouble-free and that he was eager to show that he did enable him to kind of look like this powerful, strong figure. His approval ratings have since increased, not because of that, but because of other things, but it certainly wasn't a hit on his popularity. I think in the case of Trump, it really remains to be seen. He's clearly trying to use the same tactic of saying, look, I'm such a strong leader that I can walk out of the hospital after 2 or 3 days, notwithstanding this infection, and be totally fine. And that was what that whole, display was about on the balcony and the like. The difference, though, is in Trump's case, he is older. I think he's a lot healthier than Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has always been an exercise fanatic. Trump is obese. He's 10 years older. Clearly was debilitated by this disease, and it remains to be seen how this disease resolves itself within Trump's body. But clearly the political tactic is very similar.
Yeah, so fascinating. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Glenn.
Good to be with you guys.
Still to come, just hours away from the first and only vice presidential debate, Trump campaign senior advisor for strategy Steve Cortes is going to join me for a preview. That's when Rising continues.